The thing about Isolara Station that most people never understood, people who read my dispatches from the comfort of Earth or the inner habitats, people who processed the war through headline summaries and official briefings, is that it didn't feel like a frontier. It felt like a secret. You approached it on the shuttle run from Waypoint Kessler, and for 2 hours there was nothing outside the viewport but black, then a smear of light, then the station resolving out of darkness like a word you'd been trying to remember, all angles and warm amber porthole glow, antennae arrays bristling from its upper hull like the raised hairs on a man who has just heard something wrong in the dark. There were maybe 400 people living there when I arrived. Miners mostly. Technicians. A skeleton crew from the Coordination Authority, and the separates. That was what the authority called them in official language. The Isolari called themselves something that didn't translate cleanly, something closer to those who remain or those who hold the line. They were the original settlers of the station, or the children and grandchildren of the original settlers, and they had decided, with the particular stubbornness of people who have watched their home become a political chess piece, that Isolara belonged to them, not to the authority, not to the Kontinuum compact negotiations that were being conducted that season in the station's upper conference suite, not to anyone who hadn't bled for the recycled air and the mineral dust and the 14-hour maintenance shifts that kept the whole structure alive. I came to cover the talks. That was my assignment. The Coordination Authority wanted favorable coverage of the compact negotiations. They wanted human readers to feel that the Kontinuum were being managed, that the process was orderly, that humanity was at the table as an equal. My editor at the Continental Wire Services had given me the posting without ceremony. Go write something that doesn't scare people, she'd said. That was the job. Don't scare people. My wife Merritt came with me. She was not a journalist. She was a medical technician who had spent 8 years working trauma wards on occupied platforms, and she had a way of reading a room, reading a situation, reading a person's face that I had never possessed and had always envied. She was small and dark-eyed, and she did not scare easily. She had looked at the assignment brief and said, "That station is going to be trouble." I had told her she was probably right. She had said she was coming anyway, because someone had to keep me from filing the story the authority wanted instead of the one that was true. That was Merritt. That was exactly Merritt. We arrived 3 days before the talks were scheduled to open, and within 6 hours of docking I understood that she had been correct. The station was trouble in the specific, quiet way of a pressure vessel that has been running slightly over tolerance for too long. You couldn't point to it. You couldn't write a lead paragraph about it. It was in the way the Isolari moved through the common corridors, deliberate, close to the walls, eyes tracking. It was in the way the authority security detail occupied the main junction points with a studied casualness that was not casual at all. It was in the layered graffiti on the corridor walls of the lower residential decks, which had been painted over and painted over again, each layer of gray sealing another layer of words, so that the walls were thick with covered speech. I took my time learning the station before I filed anything. That was always my method. See the place before you try to describe it. The civilian quarters were on levels 4 through 7, carved out of the original industrial bays by settlers who had taken metal shear tools to ductwork and partition panels and made rooms where the blueprints had shown open storage. It was a particular kind of architecture, the architecture of people making permanent what had been intended as temporary, and you could see it everywhere. The corridors that had been widened by centimeters over decades of small adjustments, the communal kitchen on level 5 that occupied 3 meters of what the original plans designated as an emergency equipment bay. The school on level 3, with its hand-lettered sign above the hatch, and the crayon drawings covering every visible centimeter of the interior walls. I spent 2 hours in that school on the first day, talking to the woman who ran it. She was 60-something and had been born on the station and spoke about teaching the way people speak about a vocation rather than a job. She had developed the entire curriculum herself, or rather with a succession of other teachers over 2 decades, because the authority standard curriculum assumed students who would eventually return to a planetary surface, and her students would not. Her students needed to understand life support mathematics, the physics of vacuum, the biology of closed-loop systems. The standard curriculum spent 3 years on terrestrial ecology. Her students got a week on terrestrial ecology, and the rest of the time on the actual conditions of their actual lives. Do the authority evaluators ever review the curriculum? I asked. They do, she said, every 4 years. She looked at the drawings on the walls. They note deviations from standard. They recommend alignment. I file a response acknowledging the recommendation. She paused. Then I keep teaching what my students need to know. I filed a neutral opening dispatch. I described the station's architecture. I noted the delegation's arrival schedule. I used the words cautious optimism because my editor liked the phrase, and I put it down and felt the familiar quiet shame of a man who knows he is not yet writing the thing he came to write. The Kontinuum arrived on the second day. I had covered their delegations before, from a distance, in the safe and managed press pools that the authority set up for such events. I had seen them through viewports and on screens, and in the authority's carefully curated visual briefings. None of that had prepared me for proximity. The Kontinuum did not send individuals. That is the first thing to understand. What they sent were extensions, biological units that shared, in some way that the xenobiologists still could not fully explain, a distributed processing architecture. Each unit was distinct in appearance, but they moved in a coordination that was subtly wrong by human standards. Not synchronized the way soldiers march, which is a chosen, effortful synchrony, something more fundamental. They responded to stimuli almost simultaneously. They did not finish each other's sentences because they did not need to begin them. They resolved to a shared output before the first syllable. They were tall, though height was not the thing that stayed with you. Their bodies were bilaterally symmetrical, which gave them a superficial familiarity, but the symmetry extended inward in ways that it doesn't for humans, their organs mirrored. Their neural pathways redundant in a way that meant destroying half of one was roughly equivalent to destroying a fingernail. They communicated between units through a low-frequency resonance that human ears registered as a slight pressure change in the inner ear, a constant almost sound that, after a few days of exposure, you stopped noticing, until you left their vicinity and realized how much quieter the world had become. They had arrived at the station's docking bay with the quiet efficiency of things that do not feel the weight of a moment. No ceremony, no hesitation at the threshold. They moved through the docking corridor as though the space already belonged to them, not arrogantly, not aggressively, but with the particular confidence of something that does not doubt its eventual destination. The authority representatives met them with handshakes and smiles. The Kontinuum units acknowledged the gestures with calibrated responses, not cold but not warm, appropriate, in the way of a system that has modeled human social protocols and executes them with precision without experiencing them. I watched them log every face, every detail of the corridor, every junction and relay point as they passed, and I understood that the assessment had already begun. They had been in contact with humanity for 41 years. They had never attacked a human settlement directly. What they did instead was negotiate until negotiation produced what they wanted, and what they wanted, consistently and without apparent malice, was consolidation. They absorbed smaller polities. They incorporated outlying stations and habitats into their compact. They were not, in any conventional sense, aggressive. They simply could not conceive of the desirability of separateness. Their entire biological and social architecture was premised on the value of collective integration. A community that insisted on remaining outside the compact was, to them, not exercising a right but expressing a pathology, like a cell refusing to participate in an organism. They did not hate the Isolari. They pitied them, the way a healthy body might theoretically pity a malfunctioning organ, while also moving with calm efficiency to address the malfunction. That was what made them dangerous. They were not our enemies because they wished us harm. They were our enemies because they could not imagine why we would want to remain ourselves. The talks were scheduled for 5 days. On the first day, the authority and the Kontinuum delegation exchanged formal position statements in the upper conference suite. The Isolari were not invited. They were not considered a party to the negotiations. The authority's position was that Isolara Station was a coordination authority installation, and that the residents, however long settled, however legitimate their grievances, did not constitute an independent entity with standing to negotiate. I sat in the press enclosure and took notes and understood, for the first time, what Merritt had meant. The station was not trouble in the way of a place where violence was likely. It was trouble in the way of a place where an injustice was being administered with perfect procedural correctness, and where the people on the receiving end of it had been waiting, for years, for someone to notice. I noticed. The Isolari had a leader, though they would have rejected the word. Dara Fenn. She was 38 years old and had been born on the station, the daughter of a mining engineer who had come out on a 15-year contract and never left because, as he had apparently put it, there was no good reason to go anywhere you can't see the hull seams. Dara had his coloring pale, with the particular pallor of people who have grown up under artificial light, and his directness, and absolutely none of his apparent contentment. She was not content. She was furious in the controlled way of someone who has been furious for a long time and has learned to metabolize it. She found me, or rather she found Merritt, they knew each other slightly, from overlapping circles in the Habitat medical networks, and she sat across from us in a station canteen that smelled of recycled protein and machine oil, and she told us what was actually happening. The compact will absorb us, she said, not as a prediction, as a statement of established fact, the way you would say the sun rises in the east. The authority has already agreed to it. The 5 days of talks is procedure. It's ceremony. They need a record that shows consultation occurred. What do the Isolari want? I asked. She looked at me the way people look at a journalist who has just asked a very stupid question. We want to stay what we are, she said. We want to remain, that's all. That's the entirety of it. The Kontinuum would say you'd have more resources under the compact, I said. I was testing the argument, not endorsing it, but she heard it the way it deserved to be heard. The Kontinuum would say we'd have more of everything, she said. They're probably right. They'd also have access to our deep core surveys, our navigation data, our communication relays. They'd have us. And in 10 years, 20 years, whoever is living here would think of themselves as Kontinuum because that's how consolidation works. It doesn't kill you. It just makes you forget you were ever anything else. She picked up her cup. I have 3 children on the station. My mother is buried in the memorial archive in level 4. I'm not interested in forgetting. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she wanted nothing from me. She said she had been told I was someone who wrote true things, and she had no particular use for true things because true things had been written about the Isolari before and had not helped, but she was willing to keep talking to me if I was willing to keep listening. That was a fair offer. I took it. I filed that dispatch, too. The authority flagged it within 4 hours and asked me, through politely worded channels, to consider the wider context before continuing in that vein. I considered it. I continued in that vein. The next morning, a woman came to find me in the press room. She introduced herself as Vesna Kors, liaison coordinator for the Kontinuum delegation. Her title was an authority creation. The Kontinuum did not employ human liaisons exactly, but the authority had found it useful to maintain a human interlocutor who could speak to the press on the delegation's behalf, in human language, with human cadences, in a way that the units themselves could not manage without the effect being subtly but persistently wrong. Vesna was good at her job. She was in her mid-30s, composed, precise without being cold, and she had the particular quality of attention that I had come to associate with people who had been around the Kontinuum long enough to absorb some of their observational patience. She watched me the way the units watch things, not aggressively, but completely. She told me the dispatch I had filed misrepresented the Kontinuum's position. She said this without defensiveness, as a statement of factual correction, and she laid out the Kontinuum's account. That the Isolara claims about assessment protocols were overstated, that the access granted was standard and procedural, that any atmospheric fluctuations in the residential section were consistent with maintenance cycling rather than deliberate interference. She said this carefully, and it was technically true in the way that a description of a knife as a kitchen implement is technically true. I told her I had the engineering logs. She knew I had the engineering logs. That was why she was there. She was not attempting to suppress the story. It was already filed, but she was doing something more careful, which was to establish on record a competing interpretation of the same facts. She was very good at it. I have been a journalist for 20 years, and I have met many people who are skilled at the construction of interpretations, and she was among the best. The Isolari are a small community under significant stress, she said, near the end of the conversation. Their perception of events is understandably filtered through that stress. That doesn't make their concerns invalid, but it does mean that external documentation needs to be read with some understanding of the context. You've been embedded with the delegation for how long? I asked. 3 years. What do you think of them, personally? She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone formulating an evasion, the silence of someone considering a genuine question. I think they are what they are, she said finally. A collective intelligence that has found a method for surviving and expanding, and that executes that method with absolute consistency. I don't think they intend harm. I think they are incapable of weighting individual loss the way we do, because for them there is no meaningful distinction between an individual unit and the collective. A unit lost is recovered by the whole. The whole is not diminished. And people, I asked, when they lose someone? She looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. She had heard about Merritt. Everyone on the station had heard about Merritt. That, she said carefully, is the part of the equation they haven't modeled correctly. She left. I did not know what to make of that conversation for several days. I still do not know entirely. What I know is that when the lockout happened, and when the Kontinuum delegation moved toward departure, Vesna Kors filed a report to the authority that did not, for the first time in her 3-year tenure, characterize the Isolari's position as a misunderstanding. She filed a report that characterized it as a position, a considered, legitimate human position. She was removed from her liaison role within a week of the delegation's departure. I do not know where she is now. I hope she is somewhere she chose. It is the kind of hope that does not help anyone, and that I carry anyway. Merritt spent those first days in the lower residential decks, because Merritt always went where the work was, and the work in the lower decks was the people, the families, the children, the elderly station residents who had been through 3 rounds of authority negotiations over the years and knew exactly what the procedural correctness meant and what it was covering. She came back to our quarters each night and sat on the edge of the bunk and told me what she had seen, and I wrote it down in my private notes, and I understood, incrementally, that I was not covering a diplomatic summit. I was covering the last hours of a community that was about to be erased with paperwork. She had a particular talent for being trusted by strangers quickly. I don't mean charm. Charm is a performance. What Merritt had was attention. She listened the way a good doctor listens, which is to say completely, without preparing her next thought while you were still speaking. People felt it. They opened to it the way plants open to light, instinctively, without deciding to. In 3 days, she knew more about the inner workings of Isolara Station than I had learned in a decade of covering the outer habitat networks, because people had told her things they wouldn't put in a public record. The water recycling issues on level 7 that had been logged, and not repaired for 18 months. The authority technician who had been quietly pressuring Isolara engineers to approve system access they didn't want to approve. The medical bay shortfall that had been accumulating since the last supply run. On the third day, the Kontinuum units began moving through the station, not in the upper conference levels in the residential corridors, in the common spaces. They did it quietly, with the authorities' blessing, as a gesture of integration, the authority spokesman said, a way of demonstrating the compact's intentions. The Isolari understood it for what it was: reconnaissance, assessment, the kind of measured attention that a thing pays to something it is about to incorporate. I watched one of the Kontinuum units standing at the far end of a corridor on level 6, studying the children's artwork mounted on the bulkhead. The drawings were the usual things: stylized stars, clumsily rendered station diagrams, family portraits in crayon where everyone floated slightly above the ground, because these were children who had grown up in variable gravity and drew it instinctively. The Kontinuum unit looked at those drawings for 4 minutes by my count, with the unblinking patience of a creature that does not experience time the way we do. Then it moved on. I followed it at a distance for part of that afternoon. It moved through the common corridors with methodical attention, pausing at junctions, examining relay panels, spending particular time at the environmental monitoring stations positioned throughout the residential levels. It was not doing anything overtly inappropriate. Assessment access had been granted, and it was assessing. But the quality of attention it brought to the environmental systems was more focused than anything else I had observed it study, and I made a note of that. And that evening I told Merritt, and she made a note of it too. I do not know if we could have prevented what happened. I have turned that question over many times in the 8 months since. I think the honest answer is no. Not because we lacked the information, we had most of the relevant information, but because the Kontinuum had authorized access, under the protocols, to the systems they used, and nothing we knew rose to the level of evidence that the authority would have acted on before the talks concluded. We would have been told we were speculating. We would have been told the process was proceeding within the existing framework. We would have been managed. Dara Fenn came to find us on the third night. She did not knock so much as appear in the doorway of our quarters, which said something about the informal security culture of the lower decks. "We're going to make a presentation," she said, "to the full delegation, authority and Kontinuum together. We've petitioned under Section 14 of the Coordination Charter. They have to hear us. They don't have to listen, but they have to hear." When Merritt asked, "Day 4, tomorrow afternoon before the closing session." I said I would be there. Merritt said she would help them prepare. She had a way of taking on a cause that was not loud or declarative. She simply became part of it, quietly and completely, the way water becomes part of the ground it soaks into. I should tell you about the presentation now, because it matters, not for what it achieved, which was almost nothing in any immediate sense, but for what it was, for what it cost. There were 22 Isolari who stood in the conference antechamber the next afternoon, facing a delegation that had not wanted to see them and was watching the clock until it was procedurally permissible to stop doing so. Dara Fenn spoke for 20 minutes. She had no prepared text. She had a life, 41 years of it, lived entirely on that station, and she spoke from it with the precision of someone who knows that every word is being evaluated for later dismissal and is determined to make dismissal as difficult as possible. She spoke about the station's founding and the first-generation settlers who had built the life support systems with their hands. She spoke about the memorial archive and the names in it. She spoke about the children's school on level 3, which had a curriculum developed specifically for children who would grow up in deep space, because the standard authority curriculum assumed an earthbound developmental context and was, in practical terms, useless out here. She spoke about the 15-year shifts and the mineral contracts, and the way the station's economic output had, over 40 years, produced returns that fed into authority infrastructure budgets, while producing almost nothing for Isolara itself. She was not angry when she spoke. She was something harder than angry. She was precise. She spoke about her mother briefly at the end. Not sentimentally. Factually. Her mother had arrived on Isolara at the age of 26 as part of the third settler cohort, and had spent 40 years there and had died there, and was in the memorial archive on level 4 alongside 31 other people who had made the same choice to stay and had stayed until there was no more staying to do. Dara said that these people had known what the station would cost them and had paid it freely, and she said that the compact did not have the right to determine retroactively that their choice had been a mistake. She said this quietly, and she said it looking directly at the Kontinuum units, not at the authority delegation, because she had correctly assessed who in the room had the actual power to determine what happened next. The Kontinuum units listened with that total, absorptive attention, and I watched their subtle collective orientation shift as Fen spoke, as though they were calibrating something. Processing. Filing. It was Merritt who noticed the resonance change first. She was standing near the back of the room, and she put her hand on my arm and pressed, not hard but specifically, the signal we had developed over years of covering difficult situations for something is wrong, wait. I waited. I watched the Kontinuum units. The pressure in my inner ear, that constant almost sound of their inter-unit communication, had shifted in quality. I could not have told you how I knew that. I just knew. Something in the rhythm of it, the frequency, was different, more compressed, more active. The lead authority negotiator, a man named Haskell whom I had dealt with before, and who was not a bad person but was very thoroughly a bureaucrat, thanked the Isolari delegation for their presentation. He noted that their concerns had been formally received. He invited them to submit written documentation through the appropriate channels. He used the phrase, within the existing framework, 4 times in the space of 2 minutes. He said nothing that meant anything. Dara Fen looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the Kontinuum units. Then she looked at me, across the room, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just had confirmed what they already knew and finds no satisfaction in being right. We filed out. The Isolari gathered in a cluster in the corridor outside, speaking in the low, quick way of people making decisions under pressure. Merritt stayed close to Dara. I stood slightly apart, taking notes in my head, the professional habit of a decade. That was when the station's alert system pulsed, not an emergency alarm, nothing that dramatic. Just the soft recurring tone that indicated an unscheduled change in life support cycling. Maintenance issue, probably. They happened. But Merritt turned immediately, and the look on her face was the look she had worn in 16 different emergency wards over 8 years, the look that meant she had already calculated forward to the worst plausible outcome and was now deciding what to do about it. Level 4 environmental, she said, the recycling nodes. An Isolari technician was already running. I want to be accurate about what happened next, because it has been described incorrectly many times, and the incorrect descriptions have served particular narratives, and I am not interested in narratives. I am interested in what happened. The environmental disruption on Level 4 was not an accident. The investigation, conducted 6 months later with the access that post-war settlement negotiations occasionally make possible, concluded that it had been a deliberate interference with the oxygen recycling subsystem in the residential section. Not a catastrophic failure, a calibrated reduction, enough to stress the atmosphere in the residential decks over the following 18 hours. Enough to make people uncomfortable, to make the elderly and the very young sick. Enough, in the language of the subsequent investigation, to create conditions that would encourage population compliance. The Kontinuum did not fire weapons. They did not threaten in terms that could be recorded and used against them. They adjusted the air. They had access to the environmental systems, because the authority had granted them assessment access as part of the integration preparation protocols. Standard procedure. Within the existing framework. I am going to write now about merit, and I am going to write it as accurately as I can, which means I am going to write it once and not again, because there are limits to what a man can revisit and remain functional. She knew within the first hour what was happening. She had the technical background, and she had spoken with enough Isolara engineers in 3 days to understand the station's systems, and she understood that the atmospheric reduction in the residential sections was deliberate and targeted, and that if it continued, people would be hospitalized within 12 hours and dead within 36. Children first. The elderly first. The people the Kontinuum units had categorized so thoroughly on their corridor walks. She went to the authority. She presented the engineering data. Haskell listened with the careful blankness of a man whose negotiating framework did not have a provision for what she was describing. He said he would raise it through appropriate channels. He did not raise it. I believe he told himself he was managing a misunderstanding, and that resolution was imminent, and that if he acted precipitously, he would damage the talks. I believe he was wrong in a way that is neither unusual nor forgivable. Merritt went, then, to the environmental control room on level 2. It was staffed by an authority technician who had been very clearly instructed not to permit unauthorized adjustments to systems that were under active assessment protocols. The technician was young and not a bad person, and was doing exactly what he had been told to do. He would not let her in. She spent 40 minutes on a portable terminal in the corridor outside, working with 2 Isolara engineers through a secondary access pathway, a maintenance override that the original station builders had installed as an emergency backup, and that did not appear in the authority's system documentation, because it had been built before the authority's documentation standards existed. The Isolara knew about it. They had always known about it. They had never had to use it before. She restored full atmospheric cycling to the residential section. It took 40 minutes. In that time, 14 children in the lower decks had been taken to the medical bay with hypoxic symptoms. All 14 recovered. None of them died. But the maintenance override access routed through a juncture node that registered the work as a system-level intrusion, and the Kontinuum units, who were monitoring system activity with the comprehensive attention they brought to everything, identified the source and responded. I am going to stay with what happened. I am not going to describe it in ways that serve any other purpose. The Kontinuum did not use weapons in the conventional sense then either. What they used was a localized frequency pulse, the same biological resonance they used for inter-unit communication, amplified through the station's own internal speaker arrays, for which they had also been granted assessment access. At close range, at sufficient amplitude, the frequency was physically disabling. At extreme amplitude, it was lethal. The corridor on level 2 was not at extreme amplitude. It was at sufficient amplitude to incapacitate. Merritt and the 2 Isolara engineers went down. The engineers recovered. Merritt did not. The station's medical team reached her in 11 minutes. I reached her in 14. The 3 minutes are not something I intend to analyze. She died 4 hours later of complications that I will not detail here. She was 43 years old. She had restored the air for 400 people, including 14 children, and the last thing she had said to me, said before she left to go to the control room, said in the quick practical way, she said things that mattered, was that if she could get the override running she would be back in an hour, and I should get dinner started. I am writing this account 8 months after those events. I have written about the war and the settlement and the things that came after. I have not, until now, written about Merritt. I am going to do it once and move forward. She is in the memorial archive now on level 4 with the first-generation settlers. Dara Fenn put her there. It was not a bureaucratic decision. It was a human one. What happened after, the 6 days that followed, what the Isolara and I, and eventually the other press correspondents, and eventually the outer habitat networks, and eventually Earth itself came to call the stand at Isolara. I am going to describe as plainly as I can, because it has already been mythologized more than it deserves, and I want to put something accurate on record before the mythology fully closes over it. I filed the dispatch about the atmospheric interference and about Merritt within 2 hours of her death. I filed it to every wire service I had credentials with, and I filed it without the edits the authority would have required, and I filed it with the full technical documentation that the Isolari engineers had pulled from the system logs. My editor received it. She sat on it for 4 hours because it was significant and she wanted to verify, which was the correct professional response. Then she published it. It reached the inner habitats in 6 hours. It reached Earth in 9. The authorities' communications team issued a response within an hour of publication. The response used the words disputed, under review, and existing framework in its first 3 sentences, and I knew from those 3 sentences that the authority had made a calculation. The calculation was that the story would generate noise and then subside, the way stories do, and that the talks could be concluded before the noise became politically consequential. It was not an unreasonable calculation historically. It was, in this case, wrong. It was wrong because the Isolari had been waiting for years for exactly this. Not for permission, not for an official acknowledgement, just for someone to put the documentation in front of enough people that the documentation could not be dismissed. That was what Merritt's death and my dispatch provided. Not a weapon, a witness. On the second day after the dispatch, 3 other stations in the outer habitats, Meridian Post, Kessler Waypoint Civilian Quarter, and a smaller installation called the Brackwater, made public statements of solidarity with Isolara. None of them were Isolari. All of them were communities that had been through their own versions of the same negotiation, or were about to be, and recognized in the documentation what it meant for their own situations. On the third day, 2 of the Kontinuum's 4 units stationed at Isolara withdrew. The authority announced this as a confidence-building gesture, indicating the talks were proceeding constructively. The Isolari announced it as evidence that external pressure was working. Both statements were true. Neither statement was complete. The remaining 2 Kontinuum units did not withdraw because they had been instructed to maintain the assessment. This was not a military action. It was procedural. The assessment of Isolara Station was ongoing under the protocols, and the protocols had not been suspended. The talks were continuing, and the Kontinuum were conducting the process exactly as designed. Dara Fenn told me, on the night of the 3rd day, that the Isolari had decided to move. We were in the lower deck common space, the big one on level 6, that smelled of machine oil and recycled air, and the particular combination of cooking smells that accumulates in a space that has been lived in hard for 4 decades. Her 3 children were asleep in an adjoining quarters. I had seen them earlier that evening, 2 boys and the youngest girl, 7 years old, who had stared at me with the frank assessment of a child who had already made several preliminary judgments and was not yet ready to share them. Dara had introduced me without ceremony. He's a journalist. He was Merritt's husband. The girl had considered this. Is he staying? She had asked. Dara had looked at me. I don't know, she had said honestly. Around us, 30 or 40 Isolari were sitting or standing in the tight economical way of people in small spaces. Not a meeting exactly, more the way people gather when they are trying to decide something collectively and cannot quite bring themselves to formalize it. Some of them I recognized. Powell, the level 3 engineer who had been on station for 22 years and moved through its physical systems the way a surgeon moves through familiar anatomy. Siren, his counterpart on the upper environmental decks, a quiet woman in her 50s, who had learned the station's secondary wiring from her father and had never seen any reason to live anywhere else. Breck, the big maintenance tech from level 7 who had a bad shoulder from a pressure accident 4 years back and worked through the pain because the work didn't stop and neither did he. These were not revolutionaries. They were not idealists in any romantic sense. They were people who knew how to keep 400 human beings alive in deep space, and who had been doing it for decades, and who had decided, with the particular clarity of people who have nothing left to lose by being honest, that they were done watching their home be processed into a line item. The assessment has to be terminated, Dara said. Not negotiated, not appealed, terminated. How? I asked. We lock them out of every system they have access to. Every assessment node, every monitoring feed, every relay they're reading. We do it simultaneously in a coordinated sweep, so they can't reroute before we close the last connection. That's a violation of the compact protocols, I said. Yes, she said. The authority will treat it as a hostile act. Probably. The Kontinuum might. I know what the Kontinuum might do, she said. We know exactly what they might do. We've been living next to what they might do for 41 years. She looked at her hands. We're not doing this because we think it works. We're doing it because it's true, because we're what we are and this is our station, and we're not going to let them catalog us into nothing without at least making it cost them something. She looked up. You don't have to stay. I had a dispatch to file. I had a professional obligation to a wire service and an editor and a readership. I had, in theory, no stake in the outcome. I said I was staying. I filed the dispatch first. Full documentation of the plan, stripped of any details that would have compromised the timing. My reasoning was simple. If this was going to happen and be recorded and eventually judged, it should be recorded accurately from the beginning, not reconstructed afterward from the versions that served whoever won. The lockout operation began at 200 station time, in the deep watches when human beings are at their lowest and slowest, which was, of course, precisely when Dara had chosen it, because the Isolari knew their station and knew its rhythms, and knew that the Kontinuum units would be in their least responsive operational cycle. Not sleep. The Kontinuum did not sleep, but a lower level of active processing, the way a computer cycles down its non-essential functions while maintaining basic operations. 27 Isolari technicians and engineers, positioned at relay points throughout the station, worked in coordinated silence. I was with the team on level 3, Powell and Siren, who had between them 60 years of experience with Isolara's physical plant. They moved through the station's secondary systems with the ease of people who had built the place themselves, or who had learned it from the people who had, layer by layer, the way you learn the geography of a house you grew up in. There was no hesitation in them, no visible fear. What they had instead was concentration, the focused, economical attention of experienced people doing technical work under time pressure. The Kontinuum units became aware of what was happening approximately 4 minutes in. I know this because the inner ear pressure shifted, that almost sound, that frequency, in a way that even I could now identify as urgency. There was a quality to the change, something in the rhythm of it, that was not distress in any human sense, but was a clear shift from steady state to heightened processing, like a machine spinning up. Powell looked at me across the relay panel. Faster, he said. The next 8 minutes were not heroic. They were technical. They were 2 engineers working their way through a system they knew intimately, closing doors that were not designed to close in that sequence, in ways that the Kontinuum's monitoring protocols had not anticipated because those protocols had been written to account for the systems as documented, and the Isolari had always maintained their station slightly differently from the documentation. Not deceptively, simply practically. The documentation reflected authority standards. The station reflected 40 years of living. The Kontinuum units moved toward the primary environmental hub, which was the last major access point still open. I don't know what they intended to do there. The investigation never fully resolved that question. What I know is that Dara Fenn was already there. I was not. I know what happened from Dara's account and from the sensor logs that were later recovered. I am going to describe it in the order it was described to me. The 2 Kontinuum units arrived at the environmental hub, and found Dara Fenn standing in front of the access panel with her hands flat against it and no expression on her face. Behind her, the last of the access routes was being closed by Breck, who had his bad shoulder braced and was working faster than the shoulder permitted, and was making no sound about it. The Kontinuum units communicated that pressure shift resonance, faster now, more compressed, the way a voice gets when the stakes rise. Dara could not understand the frequency communication any more than I could, but she understood the context. She understood exactly what they were communicating, in the same way you understand the meaning of a sound without knowing the language it belongs to. She did not move from the access panel. The Kontinuum units held their position for 47 seconds, which is, in retrospect, the most remarkable detail in the entire account. 47 seconds. Long enough for Breck to finish closing the last connection. Long enough for the lockout to complete. Long enough for 27 distributed technicians to confirm, one by one, over the Isolari's internal channel, that their positions were sealed. Long enough for the compressed almost sound of Kontinuum communication to cycle through several registers, as though working through a problem that was not resolving the way expected. The Kontinuum could not process what Dara was doing. This is what the xenobiologist said afterward, and I believe it is accurate, though I believe it underestimates the extent to which the thing the Kontinuum could not process was not just Dara, but the whole of what the Isolari had done and were doing and had always been doing. A collective intelligence built on integration and consensus cannot model, at any processing speed, with any degree of sophistication, a person who stands in front of something because it is true, rather than because it is advantageous. The Kontinuum's architecture was premised on the equivalence of those two things. They were not equivalent, not for humans, not for Dara Fenn. She stood there and did not move. That was all. That was the entirety of what she did. She stood in front of the last open door into the station's systems, and she kept her hands on the panel and she did not move. And behind her, a man with a broken shoulder finished the work, and 27 other people held their positions throughout the station, and the last connection sealed. The units withdrew. They did not amplify their frequency communication. They did not attempt to remove Dara from the panel by physical means, which they were biologically capable of doing. They withdrew, and the station systems registered the total disconnect of all Kontinuum monitoring access at 2:14 station time, 37 minutes after the operation began. I am going to tell you now about the reaction, because it is part of the record, and because it was not what you might expect if you have followed the mythologized version. The authority was furious. There is no other word for it. Haskell transmitted a formal censure within 2 hours and notified all parties that Isolara Station was in violation of the compact assessment protocols and that the authority was obligated under the framework agreement to restore access. He was not wrong legally. He was absolutely right legally. He was also working from a framework that had just been publicly documented as the instrument of the atmospheric interference that had killed my wife, and had been used to prepare 400 people for involuntary absorption into an alien collective. And the legal correctness of his position was something that the inner habitats and Earth were finding it very difficult to take seriously. The dispatches I had filed were being read. The documentation was being reviewed by people who were not bureaucrats with a framework to protect, by engineers in other outer habitats, by medical professionals who understood exactly what a calibrated atmospheric reduction meant, by families in the inner habitats who had been told for years that the Kontinuum negotiations were proceeding in humanity's interest, and were now looking at the technical records and asking what interest, exactly, was being served. The Kontinuum delegation requested a formal session with the authority on the day following the lockout. The session lasted 6 hours. I was not present. No journalist was. What I know is that the session ended with the Kontinuum delegation departing Isolara Station without a signed compact agreement, for the first time in 41 years of negotiations with any human settlement. They did not leave because they had been defeated in any conventional sense. They left because the operation had created a public record that made signature, at that moment, politically impossible for the authority. Not militarily impossible, not legally impossible, politically impossible, which is the kind of impossible that matters when you are operating through negotiation rather than force. The Kontinuum did not understand this distinction. This is also part of the record. Their subsequent communications, and the Outer Habitat's xenolinguistics team spent considerable time on this, showed a processing gap around the concept of a political impossibility that is not a physical or logical impossibility. For an integrated collective, something is either possible or it is not. The idea that something could be physically achievable and politically untenable was a paradox their architecture could not resolve cleanly. That paradox bought time. That is all it bought, and Dara Fenn was the first to say so. Time is not resolution. The Kontinuum would recalibrate. The authority would eventually produce a new framework. The talks would resume someday with adjusted protocols. Nothing was won in any permanent sense. But Isolara Station remained Isolara Station, and the children on level 6 kept putting their drawings on the wall. And Dara Fenn's children grew up there, in the recycled air that Marit had restored. And the names in the memorial archive on level 4 were joined by one more. I stayed for 3 months after the lockout. I filed 31 dispatches. I attended every public session that followed, and I sat in the corridors outside the ones I wasn't permitted into, and I wrote about what I observed and heard and was told by people who trusted me, in some cases, more than I deserved, simply because my wife was in their memorial archive, and they had decided that made me one of theirs. The station changed in those 3 months, in ways that were difficult to describe in a dispatch and that I am only now beginning to find language for. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have registered as news. The Isolari went on doing what they had always done, running the environmental systems, teaching the children, logging the mineral surveys, maintaining the physical plant shift by shift. But there was something different in how they did it. A deliberateness. A quality of attention that was not new but was now openly expressed rather than maintained privately. The way a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time will, once he has decided to keep carrying it, at least stop pretending it isn't heavy. Dara held town meetings, open ones in the level 6 common space, where anyone on the station could come and hear what was being negotiated and what was being refused, and what the current legal status of their home was. The authority representatives attended twice and then stopped attending, because the meetings were generating dispatches that the authority preferred not to have generated, and their presence made that easier. The Isolari noticed the absence and continued the meetings. The idea that legitimacy requires an official audience is an idea that grows in soil the Isolari had stopped cultivating a long time ago. I sat in the back of those meetings with my recorder and my notebook, and I watched 400 people figure out, in real time, what they were and what they intended to remain. It was not inspiring in any cinematic sense. It was slow and sometimes tedious and occasionally contentious. There were sharp disagreements about tactics and timelines, and the degree to which the outer habitat solidarity statements could be trusted to hold. But underneath all of it, consistent as a hull integrity reading, was the thing that had stopped the Kontinuum in the corridor outside the environmental hub. The simple weight of people who have decided to stay. I don't know if that's a strategy. I know it is a force. It is a force the Kontinuum had not encountered before and had not correctly modeled, and that mismatch between what their architecture predicted and what they found was the gap that the Isolari had been living in for 41 years without knowing it was there. There is one more thing I want to put on record, because it has not been written anywhere else that I have found, and because I think it matters. A week after the lockout, One of the Kontinuum units that had withdrawn on day 3 returned to Isolara Station. Not officially, not as part of any delegation. It came on what the authority logs described as an equipment check, a pretext that was transparent enough that no one bothered to dispute it, least of all the Isolari, who had 30 years of experience with transparent pretexts. The unit spent 4 hours moving through the station's common areas. It moved through the residential levels. It stood again at the far end of the corridor on level 6, in front of the children's drawings on the bulkhead. Dara Fenn's youngest, a girl of about 7, who had apparently been watching it from down the corridor with the pure fearless curiosity of a child who has grown up knowing aliens exist and has therefore never particularly feared them, walked up to it and handed it a drawing. I did not witness this. I was told about it afterward by 3 separate people, independently, in enough detail that I believe it occurred as described. The drawing was of the station. You could tell because of the antennae and the porthole lights. Everyone was floating slightly above the ground. The Kontinuum unit held the drawing for a long moment. Then it put it carefully, precisely, in the inner pocket of its environmental suit, in the place where a human being might put something they wanted to keep. Then it left. I have thought about that moment many times since. I do not know what to make of it. I do not know if the unit was capable of making anything of it, in any sense that maps to what I mean when I say make something of. I do not know if it carried the drawing back to its collective, and if so, what the collective processed from it. I do not know if something changed. What I know is that a child on Isolara Station handed a piece of herself to a thing that had come to catalog her people into nothing, and the thing took it and kept it and left. I filed 31 dispatches. I never filed a dispatch about that. There are some things that become smaller when you try to put them in a sentence. 8 months out now. Dara Fenn is managing a station that is still, technically, under dispute. 3 of the outer habitats have adopted versions of the Isolari's lockout protocols as contingency measures for their own systems. The authority is in the process of revising the assessment access provisions of the compact framework, which means those provisions are going to become somewhat less comprehensive and somewhat more contested, which means the next round of negotiations will be slower and noisier and more public than the last. The Kontinuum will adapt. They are very good at adapting. But adaptation takes time, and time is what the Isolari have been buying, year by year, shift by shift, in the recycled air and the mineral dust since before I was born. I came back to Earth 3 weeks ago. It was raining when I landed, actual rain. The kind you can stand under, which I had not done in more than a year. I stood in it for a while. I did not feel the things I expected to feel. I am going to go back. I said I would to Dara when I left, and she had given me the look she reserves for statements she does not quite believe but is willing to allow to stand. I am going to go back because the story is not over, and because the memorial archive is there, and because there is still the thing that needs to be written that I have not yet found the right words for. Marit would tell me to stop being literary about it and just go. She was usually right about those things. She was usually right about most things. The rain tastes like iron and salt and distance. I have a return ticket booked for next month. I am not finished out there, and I think perhaps in some specific and unresolved way that I am not yet able to fully explain, the station is not finished with me either. We are difficult creatures. Difficult to model, difficult to absorb, difficult to make stop. We draw pictures of places we love and hand them to things that came to take those places from us, and somehow, impossibly, against every calculation, that sometimes works. I do not know why it works. I know only that it does. That will have to be enough for now.